So that's what we're kind of here to discuss. All right. So very, very quick refresher. Most of us are probably familiar with Agile, the manifesto, the frameworks, the certifications, and things like that. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just worth mentioning that um, Agile was built on core values first and foremost, not any type of templates, not any type of framework. The word Scrum does not appear in the Agile manifesto. And while Agile offers many benefits like flexibility and increased collaboration and um, uh, being more adaptive, it also brings some challenges and misconceptions, and we'll explore these a little bit further. I'm just kind of assuming here that everyone has a kind of a basic understanding of Agile. I don't need to rehash this too much. And so let's talk a little bit about this. A little bit of history here. Um, Agile, the manifesto itself was signed in 2001, right? So we're dealing with a set of terms that are getting a little long in the tooth. We're going on a quarter century here, 23 years old, in terms of the original Agile manifesto, which was um, explicitly the domain of software engineers. It was not just something new that came about in a vacuum. It was in response to decades of misalignment and dysfunction that had grown up, particularly in large organizations around the software development profession. But these guys had some really good ideas, right? This idea of focusing on core principles and prioritizing those principles, not choosing one set of principles over the other, but understanding that there's a priority focus there. There's a set of principles that result in better value creation, better success outcomes. So there were some really good ideas there, and these good ideas really led to rapid adoption. Even in 2001, we were still kind of in the dot-com boom. Technology complexity and project complexity was exploding, and it continues to explode. And it required more adaptive management methods that were better suited to the unique qualities of software products. If you're building a bridge and you make a mistake and you cut a steel beam the wrong length, and you've just experienced a lot of waste, right? You're not going to salvage that piece of material. But in the world of software, if you make a mistake, you can correct that mistake very quickly and with very minimal cost. It's just a line of code that you can refactor. The idea of Agile beyond software, though, the ideas and the principles were so good that it really had a lot of versatility and appeal outside of just software. So we saw a lot of widespread adoption, and this adoption was logical, but that broad application, because of its success, was almost the very thing that maybe kind of started to dilute core principles a little bit. And that dilution paves the way for this idea of agile fatigue. Now, Standish came out with this chart that has flown around the internet in the years since, 12 years old, I should say. But they did this study and they found that teams using Agile had dramatically higher success rates. Although if you see, half of the projects are still challenged, even in the Agile context. But this graphic really took off and it fueled a lot of adoption. It fueled a lot of excitement. And, because projects in the software space and the technology space were facing so many challenges, traditional waterfall style project management was really not good enough. There was a real hunger in the market for better ways of managing software projects, and Agile kind of was that answer, right? So we saw rapid expansion here, and these success metrics really flew around, right? But there's a really important point here. This study, this 12-year-old Standish study, was really focused at Agile at the team level. And so the reality was that Agile is a software project practice and a way of working. It really was dramatically more successful. And we had some high profile examples of projects that were really rescued and saw better outcomes as a result of Agile team practices. The FBI famously, in around 2012 or so, they really turned around some large enterprise projects. We've seen lots of other examples like this, but this was all really oriented around teams. The problem with this was that what worked well at a team level, which really was rooted explicitly in the principles of the Agile Manifesto, didn't always work well at an enterprise level. And why is this? Because you got a lot of puzzle pieces, and each piece of the puzzle was a team. And each team working on a particular zone of software features or product development, it could realize the better success as highlighted in the Standish report. But a team can only work on so much, right? And at an organizational level, it takes a lot of teams and a lot of features and a lot of increments to put together a larger portfolio or a larger product. And so we saw the introduction of frameworks, and obviously, everybody knows the most popular Agile framework that's out there. It's worth mentioning that this framework is somebody's product. It's somebody's business model. Somebody does make money off of the sale and the adoption of this framework and other frameworks as well. But we needed something, right? We needed something that would coordinate the work, that would plug in the success at team level into a broader structure, into something that we could manage at an organizational level, at a portfolio level. And so that's really where we saw frameworks start to take off.
Hey,
And
Chris,
interestingly, oh,
can I interrupt you
yeah,
for just 1 second? We have
sure.
a question in the chat, and I wondered if you would have a moment to answer. It is about SAFe, and wondering if this webinar is related to SAFe only, or is it related to Scaled Agile, Lean, etc.? There's a
Yeah,
question
yeah,
in the chat.
that's a good question. This webinar is not related to SAFe only. If you look at the title here, we're talking about SAFe and other frameworks. But we're talking really in pretty generic terms, I would say. So a lot of what we will talk about is certainly very applicable to SAFe. But no, this is not a SAFe only webinar, just to answer the question. Okay. So hopefully that helps. And do please feel free to leave your comments in the chat. Yeah, sure thing. You're very welcome. Happy to answer any questions. And Laura or anybody, jump into the chat. Feel free to interrupt me. I'm happy to take questions as they arise. So, speaking of SAFe, it's a good segue. Let's actually talk about that for a little bit, right? So let's talk about framework level Agile, Agile team level versus Agile enterprise level. Now, this slide does not explicitly mention SAFe, but whether you're dealing with SAFe as your framework or an LPM style large scale Agile management practice or whatever, a lot of these kind of look a little bit like this, right? So if you see a diagram like this, or if you look at the SAFe big picture diagram, you can boil it down to concepts a little bit like this. So there's still this idea that the success of Agile really rests at the team level. So teams are the foundation, teams are the building block of enterprise value. But whether you look at a simplified diagram like this one, or you look at the SAFe big picture, a lot of times these diagrams are a little bit short on detail, right? So I like SAFe as a lexicon for concepts and how you can fit those concepts and practices together. I think that, what I don't like about SAFe is the productization of certifications, which lack a lot of tactical guidance. A lot of these certifications and specialties in SAFe are flyovers of things that really deserve their own deep dive in terms of years of experience. How does the rubber actually hit the road on implementing and executing the things associated with that? So like if you look at some of these DevOps, for instance, or solution architecture, those topics deserve a lot more than a 1 or a 2 day literacy class. And especially when you're just doing a high level flyover of topics like DevOps or solution architecture, and then you can get, quote, certified in those areas. I think there's a bit of a bubble effect that happens, and there's a bit of there's an assurance at the management level that, okay, we've got the building blocks in place and they fit together in just the right way. We've got a prescription, right? And that's kind of, and the market is hungry for prescriptions. The market wants roadmaps. Customers and organizations want roadmaps to help them manage big, complex, risky investments in ways that they can have a little bit of assurance that they're driving their risk down. They can have a little bit more assurance that something's going to work. But I do have concerns around the selling of these frameworks and certifications in a way that provides that assurance. I think in a way that's a little bit false sometimes. It can be a good start. I'm not saying there's no value in the frameworks or certifications, but I do think that it's really easy to like glom on to a certification framework or an agile framework, and expect that, okay, you invest in the framework and do the things, do the prescription, implement the framework in the way that the framework provider tells you, and you're going to increase efficiency and save costs and move faster and things like that. Because the thing about that is it's actually, and we start to dance around the root issue here. As soon as things become prescriptive, that's explicitly anti-agile, right? Like agile was a movement that was originally intended to address the failings of prescriptive frameworks, the failings of following a sequential plan. Agile really at heart was about principles and culture and things like that. And so as soon as we start investing heavily in a framework, or we start investing heavily in prescriptions, then we've already taken a big step away from the heart of Agile. But the market doesn't necessarily behave in logical ways. There's all kinds of wacky reasons why things take off. And I think for me, and this is just my opinion, but at heart, I think that, it's because primarily there's a need. There's a hunger there for better project management, better product development frameworks. And when something comes along and it looks like it may meet that need, then the wallets open and the investments happen. And I just think there's a lot of enthusiasm.
This
Um,
is great. Chris, we're getting some great
yeah,
questions. If I can interrupt you,
sure.
Judy's asking, where do you see business architecture fitting into this diagram?
Yeah, so I mean, business architecture, I would not equate that with either solution architecture or enterprise architecture here. I think the thing that I would say about business architecture is that, for one thing, you need architecture. You need some contextual organization of how business process and, you might say even process inventory fits, and what the toolkit is there. But I think it's easy to get hung up on architecture again as a prescriptive solution. I think that business architecture has a place at all three levels here, in different ways as applied. But I think for me, business architecture is something that should serve as a resource, not a prescription. Business architecture and other architectural frameworks, solution architecture is there to create a common repository of tools and a common language that creates not a process guide or a sequential guide that people have to follow. It's there to create a common cultural language and a common set of artifacts as well, processes, so that people and teams understand how are we working from the same type of playbook, right? I see business architecture more as a playbook than I do as an explicit template or prescription or set of sequential processes. I hope that helps somewhat.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a great answer. We have another question
yeah.
about the slide though, and how does it work top to bottom or bottom to top in terms of the hierarchy?
So in terms of hierarchy, hierarchy is inherent in the idea of a safe or an agile framework, right? And so um, it depends on which direction you're going, right? Let's think about first about I will start with hierarchy of value, right? Value creation, whether you're dealing with safe or just small a agile, I think there's widespread recognition that value creation starts at the team level, right? It's the people who are closest to the work, people who are closest to the customer. Um, those are the individuals that understand the most and have the best comprehension about what the customer needs. And that's where the value is created. The value is created by the people delivering. So in that way, I say, you're looking from bottom to top. And you'll notice I haven't said the word agile there, right? Like the idea of being close to the work, close to the customer, understanding your user or who's going to consume your product, how they're going to get value from their product. You don't have to say anything about agile to talk about those things. But at the same time, that's what agile is about. But then let's think about it from a management perspective, right? Like most of the customers we deal with, we're dealing with large enterprise scale customers. These customers have 10,000 or more employees. They may have hundreds or thousands of developers or even teams. They're going to have hundreds of products, features in their portfolios. How do you coordinate that? How do you arrange for prioritization, not just at the feature level, but at the portfolio and program level? You do need some sort of a framework reference there, and that management hierarchy goes from top to bottom. So, but it's not about a decision. It's not. How to say this? It's not about the power, right? You want to push the power down. So that's why I say like there's a bit of a two-way street. And when we talk about hierarchy, so I see your follow-up question here. So the question is, if a project started, will it start from a team level and gradually go up to portfolio level, or vice versa? It starts with value definition and where's the priority of that value placed, right? Like we have a limited amount of capacity, even if we have huge organizations. We have to choose what the most important thing is for the team to work on. That is defined at the program and portfolio level, right? So like projects should be initiated with the green light from a portfolio and program level. And then the team should be able to draw from a prioritized backlog of work. So if a project is started, the business rationale starts at the portfolio and program level. And I think that's, you're going to find that's broadly true, whether you're dealing with SAFe or any agile framework, or even outside of an agile framework. If you have an economically driven decision process in the enterprise, the overarching value definition and the economic decisions have to be arranged and prioritized at the portfolio and program level, whether you call it that or not. The team's job is to do the work, but the team also has to understand the rationale behind those prioritization decisions. So there's a bit of a two-way flow, right? Like prioritization and decisions and project initiation, that is from the top down. But the idea is, though, you really want to deal in broad strokes. Like you want to do the minimum level of work possible at the portfolio and program level to empower the team levels to understand what's important for us to work on and what's the overarching vision is defined by those higher management levels, so that we understand still a lot about the portfolio vision, the value vision. That's what I would say, right? So business starts at portfolio and program levels. Technology starts at team level. Yes, I would say that's accurate, right? Like the teams are the ones who are implementing, usually using technology tools, development and engineering practices and things like that. So I'm digressing a little bit, I think, from the topic, but I think these are great questions, and it's important to understand, if you are building a hierarchy on top of agile fundamentals, like how does the work flow through that hierarchy? But I think the more important question is, how does the value flow through that hierarchy? Where does value come from? How are we connecting the clutch from value creation to the overarching business vision? Those are the questions we really have to answer. And you'll notice, I'm not using Agile terminology to to answer those questions. So I hope those helps, right? So I didn't had an agreement issue there. I hope that helps. So let's think about where we are today with Agile a little bit. The promises of Agile versus where we are. I'll just remind the audience that, agility, even before 2001, the Agile movement was inspired by thought leaders and very accomplished luminaries in the software engineering world who had exposure to some other industries that had faced similar problems, and I'm thinking particularly of manufacturing. So if you're familiar with Agile, you'll understand that the idea of lean principles really fed the reimagining of the quality revolution of the 80s, late 70s, 80s, lessons from Japanese manufacturing. It's a trope, right? But like we talk a lot about Toyota and things like that. But what were the real promises of Agile that they were taking from the lean movement that came before? Efficiency, adaptability, a relentless focus on customer value. Those were the ideas that fed the signatories of the Agile Manifesto. Are we still focusing on those things in the current reality, right? And you'll see some of my thoughts here, but we have had some divergence, especially when we're dealing with large at-scale Agile implementations and large framework implementations. We have diverged from some of these core principles. And that leads to these symptoms that I call Agile fatigue. Agile fatigue is kind of my term. I mean, maybe other people are using that term, but Agile fatigue arises from the divergence between how we implement agility and Agile principles versus those original lean principles. Especially when you get into the framework implementation, and I've already touched on this a little bit, but those frameworks, especially when you have management investments, and they're being implemented across the entire organization. So you're asking thousands of people to change the way they work. You're investing in sort of these hierarchies and these structures. All of a sudden, somebody has to pay, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in order to successfully implement the framework. And you're typically told with SAFe or any Agile framework, you're dealing with 3 years or 3 to 5 years, maybe 10 years for a transformation. All of a sudden, we find ourselves very far away from the original team level success of agility that those Agile signatories were focused on. So it's ironic, right? It's ironic that Agile frameworks have a tendency to become rigid and prescriptive and require lots of big top-down front-end investments. That contrasts sharply with Lean's original emphasis on flexibility and incremental continuous improvement. Incremental continuous improvement, being open to emergent requirements, new needs, the change that's constantly happening. Like change is going to happen way faster than 3 to 5 years or 10 years. Your transformation is going to fail. I'm sorry, but like that's the reality. If you have a 10-year or 5-year transformation plan, number one, your investment's going to be really heavy, but you can be guaranteed like that plan's just not going to work. 5 years, 10 years, the time box is too long. So I would encourage everybody to reflect on how can we reintegrate lean principles, the original principles before there was such a thing as Agile. Can we reintegrate those principles into Agile practices in order to help us align our implementation in a way that better aligns with our original goals, right? Mario in the chat asked, what do you think the root cause of this rigid adherence is? Well, that's a big question. Do you think it's difficulty for organizations to break habits? Yes, I do. Is it an issue with not seeing delivered value? Yes, I think it is. I don't think that takes away from the value of the original principles, but a lot of it I think is just about scale, right? Scale leads to needs. If you have 500 Agile teams working at their own team level and really jamming it out with Agile principles, they may be doing very well, but it's a little bit like trying to build a very complicated machine or product, and the teams aren't talking to each other, or you don't have a master blueprint. You need some kind of master blueprint, but the thing is that the intuitive understanding from management in large scale organizations leads to this condition where we still feel like we need a plan. And we do need a plan, but that plan doesn't look like what management typically thinks it looks like, especially when, I'm sorry, but like you've got incentive structures and CEO bonuses and high VP level bonuses tied to success criteria that's oriented around we successfully implemented SAFe. And all of a sudden, like you're measuring activity related box checking stuff that can show the board that you successfully implemented SAFe. But you haven't successfully implemented SAFe just because you've rolled out a training program or certification program, or now everybody is using this different vocabulary. Those things are just activities. They're not results. And successful agile implementation, and I'll talk about this more in a minute. At the end of the day, you have to hold yourself to a good old-fashioned standard when you're measuring value. Look, we live in a world of commercial organizations. We have to deliver and measure value by dollars, right? The CFO is the judge. And I think, some people may not like that, but I actually like that. I like it because it keeps us honest. And it recognizes that at some level, we have to justify the agile implementation to the CFO, whether we like it or not. We should bring the CFO, like the CFO should have a seat at the table with an agile implementation, whether it's at the team or the framework level. Just in that's more in the spirit of true agility to say, give that CFO the seat at the table so they can be a collaborator and we understand what are the shared metrics, what are the outcomes we are trying to design for. And it's not just checking the box on framework implementation. So you can see kind of some of the promises versus realities here. But there's been a lot of commercialization in the agile space. And that's ironic because, there's the promise of a framework, there's the promise of a management structure there. And we get distracted by investing in the activities that are associated with that framework implementation. And that causes us to drift away from the tangible outcomes. The tangible outcomes are always designed to be delivery of value for our customers. And ultimately, that delivery of value, if that doesn't somehow translate up to the financial statement, then we're not doing it right. And that's just the reality, right? So if there's that misalignment, that's when we start to see this fatigue. And so you can see here kind of some of the symptoms of what I call agile fatigue. And I think if you start to recognize these symptoms, then if you see these in your own workplace, right, then you're probably encountering some of the cognitive dissonance around the promise of agile and what we're actually seeing or not seeing. What are some of these symptoms? Let's just zero in on them, right? Like, do you see some of these in your teams or your organization? Team members maybe exhibiting increased resistance to the idea of adopting new agile practices or modifying, even when they're intended to improve outcomes. Do you see like a growing disdain for agile specific terminology? Are those terms seen as empty or overused? That just contributes to communication barriers. That's exactly at odds with the intention of agile, right? As part 4 of this slide, let's see, are you talking about this slide, quality compromise? Just post in the chat, Shaden, whether or not that's what you're talking about. I'll continue. All right. So you say part 4 of this slide, or maybe part 4 of this slide. If it's part 4 of this slide, I'm going to talk about this quite a bit in a moment. So just put a pin in that and we'll talk about it here in a moment. Let me get through the rest of these symptoms here real quick. So are we experiencing these? Do we see lower participation in agile rituals like our stand-ups, retrospectives, agile planning sessions? If you see people checking out from those things, that's a team level symptom of agile fatigue, and you see this at management level as well. Quality compromise refers to basically the idea that there's a rush to deliver in our sprints. And again, we're kind of going through the motions here. But we can really experience compromised quality in our project delivery, and we also experience the accumulation of technical debt. Now, technical debt is another thing we may recognize creeping in. It can be insidious, it can be invisible, but technical debt probably deserves its own webinar, to be honest. And do we see higher rates of burnout and turnover among teams, especially if we're subjected to continuous high pressure agile cycles, but we're not seeing the tangible benefits. So understanding these symptoms is really the first step towards crafting a more effective response, and that's what we want to talk about, right? But before we move on to that, I do want to talk a little bit about this commercialization of the agile movement and how the business interests of that commercialization have kind of shaped the practices of agile, or the lack thereof. So we really have seen, like, between 2001 and today, for better or for worse, we've seen the transformation of agile from a movement, from a grassroots response to dysfunction, to kind of an industry. There's so many products and certifications and training and services and consulting that really just carry the agile labels in there. Certifications and some of the specialized training in particular, including the frameworks, including SAFe, these become checklist items, rather than a true reflection of capability, or understanding. Like, capability and understanding, those things are hard. Checking boxes is easier. And I think that we've got a bit of a bubble effect there, that leads to certification overload, framework rigidity, and by the providers of the frameworks and the certifications, there's a profit motive there. So when the interest becomes in selling the solution, or solution kind of in air quotes, or selling the certification, selling the framework, we've taken a big step away from the original principles. Especially since we're basically asking PMOs and executives and COEs to invest in those frameworks, and we've gotten away from the center of value creation, which is at the team level. So let's look at this through a little bit more of the lean lens. This goes back to the question in the chat as well. I'll talk quite a bit about lean here for the remainder of the presentation. I'm going to go to the chat here. In SAFe, except at team level, everything's mentioned as lean thinking, lean value stream, et cetera, but not emphasized more on agile. Why is it like that? It's about vocabulary, right? And it's a really good question, or a point that you make. I think that what we should be doing is, for one thing, we should be meeting our agile practitioners and our framework adopters where they are. And if where they are is experiencing disillusionment with the vocabulary and the nomenclature around agile, it's important to understand that stuff, those things are just tools. Agile vocabulary, framework vocabulary, SAFe management constructs, those things are just tools. But the intention originally was around, I think, values that really rose out of lean. You can take that a step further and even step away from the lean vocabulary if you want to. But if the vocabulary is causing distraction, then we've got to focus on principles, but more so, we've got to focus on the outcomes. Christopher, that's a great point. I actually have a slide that mentions FinOps here later, and I'll just hold that thought, and I'll talk about FinOps here in a moment. I'm so glad you brought that up. But we're seeing a dilution, right? We're seeing a dilution of the original lean principles, the original synergy between lean principles and agile methodologies. It emphasized overall efficiency, not efficiency from a capacity standpoint, but efficiency from an outcome standpoint. Customer value was the yardstick. So the commercialization of Agile has led to some divergence from principles. Selling frameworks and training is a different thing than improving practices. I'm not saying that frameworks and training don't have value. I mean, I'm somebody who comes from a 20-year career in selling Agile certifications and frameworks, but always with a relentless focus on the outcomes and practice improvement and continuous improvement, and how you evolve the measurement of that improvement. So there are still some practical steps that we can use to refocus on lean principles, or whatever principles, however you choose to call them. But I guess what I'm kind of advocating for here is a little bit of a return to the roots, right? Roots that prioritize genuine efficiency and value over the commercial success of somebody's product, an agile provider's product. We want to focus on the commercial success of the organization's product and practice. But I would encourage everybody to critically assess your own organization's use of agile and lean principles and vocabulary. Take a minute to think about it. Are you truly benefiting from these methodologies, or is it part of a commercial trend? It's a rhetorical question. So the overuse of some of these products can distract, and we can actually be creating barriers and friction around understanding and achieving the outcomes that Agile promises when we overuse jargon and things like that, right? So we want to get beyond buzzwords. The overuse of Agile specific terms, we're 20 years in now on the Agile movement. Some of this stuff has become wallpaper, and it doesn't necessarily foster the understanding and the collaboration that Agile was originally intended to implement or to help us with. So what I want to emphasize is the importance of simplicity. How can we simplify processes in communication, and how can we get back to principles over terminology? Terminology and nomenclature has become such a thing. And I'm going to show you guys what I mean here in just a moment. But the overwhelming presence of Agile jargon, I think jargon's a turnoff just first and foremost in itself, but it complicates rather than simplifies the real needs of good old-fashioned project management. And in the Agile world, sometimes project management has almost become a bad word. Project management is a thing of the past. But it's interesting, right? Like in mine and Laura's work, we're seeing a resurgence of project managers. Project management is still something that organizations need, whether it's done in an Agile context or a safe context or what. Predictably generating a product and business outcomes and understanding our time. How do we manage for timing? How do we manage for cost? How do we manage for scope? You don't have to do those things the way that PMI says you have to do them. You can do them in an Agile way, or you can do them in a completely different way. But those things are business needs. You're going to have to manage for those things. So how can we embrace clear, straightforward communication techniques that prioritize substance over style? How can we help our teams and our program layers and our portfolio layers? How can we keep the focus relentlessly on what matters most? And so, the question to think about here is, can we strip away unnecessary complexity? The world is complex enough. Our products and our technology environments are complex enough without getting too hung up on or having a religious debate around whether something is or isn't Agile. Are we following the playbook or right? I agree with Robert completely. That's a great comment. I'm going to read this. Robert says, on the topic of simplicity, one lighthearted way to measure project simplicity is to count the number of unique verbs in your project plan. There's a time and a place for impressive vocabularies, and I believe that the project plan is not that place. #verb sprawl. I kind of don't have much to add to that. 10 out of 10 agree. So let's talk about the root causes a little bit of Agile ineffectiveness a little bit. What are the root causes? Can we even identify them? I believe that we kind of can. And so these are them. There's others, I think, but I'll talk just about these four for a moment. What are we teaching in the Agile world? And does what we teach when we implement a framework, whether it's SAFe or another, or whether we're just implementing Scrum certifications, what do we teach in those classes, and what are we teaching our organizations to implement, and how does that match up against the realities on the ground? It's a rhetorical question, right? Is what we're teaching being realized? Is the daily reality of what our product lines and the value creation that is promised by the world of Agile and the prescription frameworks or whatever it is that however we're trying to get there, if that's not matching up, then we're going to have frustration. The other thing is just the cultural impact, right? And this is another thing. This is not Agile's fault, but Agile often requires a shift in mindset. Agile requires a cultural shift, and sometimes that shift just it might not be feasible in every organizational context, especially if the organization has deeply ingrained traditional practices. And let's face it, like every organization of a certain size probably has deeply ingrained traditional practices. We're not talking about something where you can check a box. We have to embrace a cultural shift, a mindset shift here. What does that look like? And it's not too hard to understand what that looks like at team scale, but what about enterprise scale? That is a really tough question. So again, we run into this irony of the kind of the inflexibility that we experience in a lot of agile quote unquote implementations, where frameworks that are marketed as flexible are actually applied in a one size fits all manner. And now we have coaches or advocates having a religious debate about whether or not we're calling something by the right terminology or whether something is or isn't agile. One size fits all doesn't work in today's world, and it's only getting worse. At the same time, like as humans, we kind of need some consistency. We need a framework. So, like, I'm not necessarily down on frameworks completely, but I'm down on what the incentives are behind implementation of those frameworks. So think about these root causes, right? How can we avoid these or address them? So I just want to take a moment to highlight some fundamental, good old fashioned project management needs. And these are a few, there's others as well, right? But I would just remind us all that while tools and methodologies change, the fundamental needs of product development and project management, even in the face of evolving tech landscapes and things like that, these needs remain constant. And if we neglect the basics, then we have project failures, regardless of the methodology used. So how can we focus on adaptability? And I don't mean adaptability as a buzzword, but I mean as a genuine practice that involves having process in place and having, yes, architecture in place that creates a flexible backdrop so that we can make adjustments based on real-time feedback and changing situations. That requires collaboration and communication. These are the backbones of any successful project management strategy, far beyond any specific agile practice, right? Like it's not the Scott, gladly, I would love to. Maybe we have a meetup. Agile RTP has a good meetup. They're always looking for topics, so we can think about that. Anyway, the idea here is that understanding and meeting these fundamental needs, this is more important than the label or the methodology, right? So this brings me to this slide. I call this Agile alternatives. So Agile is dominant out there even today. But we want to understand a variety of methodologies, and I think this is really like the crux of this talk today. It's worth taking a look at, well, if we've got this, if we are experiencing kind of this agile fatigue, if people have invested in Scrum, or if people invested in Safe, and it's 3, 5, 10 years down the road, and it's like, did we really get anything from this? The thing to understand is, I think that it can be interesting to start to triangulate from other areas of nomenclature. And I will show you guys something real quick here. So this is just a sheet that I put together as I was preparing this this discussion, in which I tried to think of as many agile terms, and I tried to match those to these like alternative terms that come from lean and or another precursor, right? And so what you see is, like, I was able relatively quickly to generate 120 terms here. And you can choose these however you want, right? But like these terms on the left are all kind of from the Agile dictionary, but none of these terms really were created from scratch. They kind of have a precursor or a parallel that comes from lean, or from total quality management, or any of the other like proto frameworks. And yeah, I'll gladly share this sheet. I'm going to read Robert's other comment because, Robert, you have great contributions. He floats another candidate for root cause: communication traffic jams. So true. Meetings and email have low upfront costs, popular, but high marginal costs. Conversely, structured documentation has high upfront costs, yes, unpopular, but low marginal costs, which we like. So what are you going to prioritize there, right? I agree with this completely. Chayton, I'm gonna put a pin in this just from time's sake. I think your question is a great one, but it almost deserves a webinar of our own, right? But I just wanted to show you guys this, because if we're thinking about vocabulary, the agile release train, or the art in SAFe, it's really just this idea of production leveling that comes from lean. And you can agree with some of these or not, but I think it's just worth thinking about this, right? Like, you don't have to say the word agile or use any of this vocabulary in order to have a very in-depth, a very detailed conversation about what we're trying to do here. So I want to address the question that came up in the chat briefly, of the idea of FinOps, right? So like, I'm just these next 3 or 4 slides are from a different webinar that I did. When did we do it, Laura? Maybe a couple months ago or whatever. That was specifically on FinOps and TBM, and I'm just going to breeze through these, because FinOps and TBM, it's essentially an agile movement that is arising, I think, in response to some of the technology shop, IT shop driven side agile implementations, but where they didn't bring the CFO along, right? Like, they're asking for different types of investment and funding structures. We're starting to see more conversation around agile funding, agile finance. But even as the world of SAFe and the world of agile has started talking about those things, like finance hasn't waited. Finance is having a different, they're not using agile vocabulary. A lot of the core needs they're trying to address are the same, just from their side of the business. And I think that's very interesting. And crucially, we've got like some interesting tools that have come up. This is the key thing here, right? And I mean, I've kind of made this point a little bit, but at the end of the day, whether or not we're being successful, we need dollar measurements here. A CFO can't do anything with story points, and there are a lot of ways emerging to do this. So like, here's one where, if we think from a finance and a funding standpoint, and we're using more of an LPM frame rather than a SAFe frame, or rather than an agile dictionary to talk about these things, this is kind of how we can decompose some of this. Funding can come from all over the place, and some of the, this could be the SAFe implementation here, or we may have a product forward way of working here. We may be funding things at the business epic level. There's actually all kinds of ways to do this, but we've got to be able to measure it, right? So like, these are some screenshots that I pulled from the Apptio tool suite. Apptio, now owned by IBM. FinOps is not explicitly related to cloud computing. FinOps is certainly associated with cloud computing, so I'm not saying you're wrong about that, but how is it related to Agile and SAFe? It's related to Agile and SAFe because if you think about FinOps, it's essentially tailor-made to embrace like an LPM style of technology portfolio management. And you're only one step away from SAFe and Agile at that point. Like, right, we almost see a parallel convergence of the enterprise evolution here. It's very interesting, right? It's very exciting. But I would say this is Apptio's tool suite. So they've got a few tools. It's now owned by IBM. But check out Apptio for sure. Like, Apptio is explicitly designed to implement FinOps, but it's basically a dovetail to LPM and lean portfolio management. Of course, lean is right there in the title, but LPM is an outgrowth of, Scaled Agile has tried to own a piece of it, but like, LPM has taken off, and LPM is an interesting way of performing PPM and portfolio management. I'm just going to go through some of these other screenshots while I do this. And like, if you look at some of this, like, you can see that this, like, the Apptio tool set is explicitly designed to support essentially Agile at scale practices. But you're not seeing a lot of Agile vocabulary here. But if you look at what the dashboards are doing, they're still doing the same thing that Agile or SAFe advises, but they're making it real. They're making it real with financially integrated dashboards. And so this is like Laura said, we've got a whole other webinar on this. So I'll now just stop on this slide for a second here. Yeah, sure. So if you look at some of these other ideas, these do not rely on the Agile playbook or Agile vocabulary, but they're other movements that we're seeing they're very valuable strategies. So one size fits all for project and product management. Agile is like front and center as an example of a methodology that might not suit every organizational environment. But we've got some other interesting things going on here. But before you get to the product or the framework that you want to implement, I think like the thing to understand is organizational context. How does my organization define value? What's the value stream? Like you should map the value stream, again, like a very old idea from Lean. And then it's kind of what's old has become new again in an LPM context, which puts value stream management front and center. But you don't even need a framework to map the value stream. Like we should map the value stream and understand how do we get from customer value, user value to dollars and ROI, right? Like our CFO has to understand that. And there's not always a good answer for that, but we need to understand like what the specific needs are and then design implementation strategies accordingly. Like there's some real basic stuff here that it may be still 3 or 4 steps away from the actual measurement of our framework success, but those fundamentals have to be established before we can get there. And I'm talking about things like stakeholder engagement, just general continuous improvement, and some metrics to intelligently measure those things. The world of DevOps has a lot to offer here as well. Flexibility, managing projects in ways that embrace emergent requirements. Open leadership, leaders that are willing to adjust their strategies, leaders that are willing to push decision power down towards the distributed, like quote unquote, cloud of teams and employees. But think about it. Think about the current project management in your organization and how these strategies could be applied to have some better efficiency. I'm coming up on the end of my time, so I'm going to I've only got a couple more slides here. But this is this is not rocket science here. Principles over process. These can still be the Agile Manifesto, right? Like we don't have to discard that. Like I think it's a big mistake. Like I mentioned with the project management angle a little bit earlier, sometimes we kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. Oh, it's the old thing isn't working. What's the new thing? Let's embrace the new thing. But the thing is, it's like wherever you go, there you are. You can change your clothes, but the issue that you had when you put on the new suit of clothes is still with you. And that's kind of what I see happening here. So, what we're really trying to do is like create a sustainable innovation culture. We're dealing with principle-based stuff. You can call it Agile or not. Honestly, it doesn't really matter whether you call it Agile. I think that the only reason it would matter is just if you are encountering this fatigue, if you're encountering resistance to change. But there are some universal things that can be embraced, whether you're within or without of an Agile framework. Foundational principles, teams, like value always starts with teams. How much turnover do you see? Like, is your organization a place where the teams feel like their work is able? That's a Lean principle. People taking fulfillment in their work, and so that they're intrinsically motivated. Like that's how you're going to get things done, not by imposing a process. So it doesn't matter what the project management methodology is that you're using. The thing that you need to prioritize, obviously, is like persistent, long-lived teams that are bought in. So how can we enhance team dynamics? Giving the teams platforms. So this goes back to the business architecture point, right? Like instead of imposing architectural frameworks, architecture should be an enabler. And the big trend around this these days is platform. So that we have shared tools, shared simulated environments, shared testing environments, shared artifacts and resources that teams, no matter where they're coming from the organization, can pull from those platforms, and then I think that's a great movement. Um, but I mean, these are some of the things we're really trying to do, and Agile, as originally envisioned, was explicitly designed to try to encourage these things. But sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But no matter what your framework or your nomenclature is, these are some of the things that you're going to do. And I highlight this in red because you've got to have the leadership buy-in here. And I think that's the show-stopping conversation for me sometimes. If I'm having a conversation with a transformation client who wants to implement something, then I always kind of start by gauging and assessing the leadership posture. If you don't have air cover to make mistakes and experiment, and figure out what the metrics are, I mean, that's a big part of it. Prescriptive frameworks don't work because they purport to give you a set of measurements and metrics and KPIs, but you don't actually always know what the metrics and the KPIs are. So it's not about implementing KPIs. It's about implementing disciplined experiment processes so that you can discover what your own KPIs are, because they're going to vary, right? So if you don't have some of these leadership qualities at play, then sorry, but like there's a big headwind there. And I understand that we don't always have the power to influence these things. So it is on the hour, so I'll wrap up. I'll just sum up here, right? If I just leave you a handful of takeaways here, these are the takeaways that I would encourage us to think about. Um, how can we get back to basics? How can we simplify? How can we get back to the principles that inspired Agile? Not even the Agile principles themselves, but the principles that fed into the Agile movement in the first place. And then, like Laura said, she'll send out this sheet that I have that compares the 120 terms. It's just a good thought experiment. Like, do we really need Scrum? Do we really need SAFe? What are those things intended to actually do? We can probably actually move the needle on some of those things without necessarily investing in somebody's product. But at the end of the day, we're trying to achieve these lean outcomes, right? Continuous improvement, reduction of waste, employee empowerment. It's lean stuff. It's not SAFe stuff. SAFe packaged up a bunch of lean stuff. PMI did the same thing, right? Like PMI didn't invent anything that was in the PMBOK. PMI curated a bunch of stuff and put it into a structured body of knowledge that we could use for project management. So, Laura, I'll kick it back to you. As usual, I'm about 1 minute over my time, but I really thank everybody for everybody's time.